weeks, we've been laying the foundation for stewardship. You are not your own. You're God's treasured possession. You are bought at a price through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Furthermore, you don't own your time, your energy, your money, your skill, or your stuff. You only manage them for the King. And you're called to do that, we said last week, with wisdom and faithfulness. This week, we're going to turn to the book of Proverbs to find some of that practical wisdom. The title of today's message is Honor the Lord with Your Wealth. Proverbs 3:9, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. But the topic we're going to cover today is actually broader than that. It's about ordering your life now so that you see good and God-honoring outcomes later. So my original sentence was, God offers practical spiritual advice for financial management. But as I worked, it became, God offers practical spiritual advice for life management. As my Puritan friends would say, not just your wealth, but all of life is God's. But the first practical step in life or financial management is to keep the foundational principles in mind. King David does this so well in 1 Chronicles 29, felt like I really needed to include these verses. He thanks God here for the generosity of his people in giving for the future temple. But here's what he says. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head over all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. And now we thank you, our God, and praise your glorious name. But, David says, who am I? And what is my people that we should be able thus to offer willingly? They were taking an offering for the temple. For all things come from you, and of your own we have given to you. So if you're going to be a good steward in a world that values only personal fulfillment, you need this kind of thinking as a daily discipline. First, get your eyes on God. He is great in power and majesty, exalted as head over all. Everything in heaven and on earth is his, and is worthy of all praise. Second, recognize as a result that all things come from him. And when we give time, energy, money, or anything else, we are only given what he has given us. So look at all your stuff and think about your limited yet abundant stores of time and energy, the unique skills, the gifts that you have, and say every day with thanksgiving, all of this, every single bit of this comes from you. Then you'll be ready for practical stewardship. We're going to look at 4 practical principles this morning, each of which can be applied to your money, but also touch on larger issues of life. The 4 are righteousness, diligence, planning, and dependence. So first, we manage wealth, we manage life with a priority on righteousness. Proverbs 16:8. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice. This word righteous is a key biblical word, no less so in Proverbs than it is up in Romans. Its central idea is to conform to a moral standard. God is righteous. He perfectly adheres to the moral standard expressed in his attributes: perfect love, perfect justice, perfect compassion, perfect wisdom, perfect grace, etc., etc. We are righteous when as creatures we conform to and obey his moral law that expresses that character. But in our culture, as we've said, to accept this is to push upstream against the water the culture swims in. The cultural norm that says, be true to yourself and don't let anyone tell you how to live your life. And yet this conformity that we're called to, conformity to God's moral law, is both good and good for us. Proverbs 11:19. Whoever is steadfast in righteousness will live, but he who pursues evil will die. Proverbs 15:6. In the house of the righteous there is much treasure, but trouble befalls the income of the wicked. Here, righteousness is connected to life and death, prosperity and poverty. Now, before we go on, let me make a comment I make every time we study Proverbs, that Proverbs are proverbs, not promises. They're distilled nuggets of observed wisdom, reporting the results of certain behaviors or attitudes in the normal course of life. But you can't claim a proverb and expect God to do it the way you can the more explicit promises of Scripture. On the other hand, if you do follow a proverb, often it will work out the way the proverb claims. Now, here, in the case of righteousness in life, there is an exception, because righteousness and life have an explicit connection that comes through the death and resurrection of Jesus. In him, we are declared righteous and receive life. That's not a proverb, that's a promise. But there is a proverbial connection as well in this book. If you live morally, things go better. And if you violate God's standards, things don't. Take drug abuse. A cycle of abuse with its health impacts, with its illegalities, costs, and its effects on your health, that usually leads a person into a mess. And while you may survive the experience, you will have all kinds of quagmire, not least of which may be financial. If you never enter that cycle, none of those bad things happens. That's the way the proverbial nature of Scripture and the way God's world works. Righteousness, then, the pursuit of God's moral standard, is a common call in Proverbs. But what is this righteousness? Listen to Proverbs 15, 16, and 17. It says, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a fattened ox and hatred with it. So these are parallel verses. Proverbs 16:8 that we read before starts with, better is a little with righteousness. Well, this one says better is a little with the fear of the Lord. Righteousness and the fear of the Lord are parallel attitudes. We've learned before that to fear the Lord is to be in awe of him, as I hope we were in worship this morning, awe of his works, of the power that created and sustains the universe, which is his power. To fear the Lord is also to dread him, to dread his judgment, knowing that his wrath over sin is both just and real. And finally, to fear the Lord is to respect him, to a respect that shows up in obedience to him. So one way we pursue practical righteousness is to pursue the fear of the Lord by building into our lives awe and worship and obedience. And this verse also says that treasure brings trouble. Back in 16:8, righteousness was the opposite of injustice. Here, the fear of the Lord is the opposite of great treasure. I don't think this means the treasure is necessarily evil. Scripture doesn't say that, but Scripture warns time after time against making prosperity, treasure, stuff the center of our lives, because that does lead to trouble. Trevin Wax has a chapter in his latest book called Shopping for Happiness, which he says is what the American culture teaches us to do. So he tells the story of his brother-in-law, Brannon, an up-and-coming, affluent young doctor. Brannon built a house on a hill, celebrated it, and days later mourned as it burned to the ground. Brannon acknowledges that before the fire he charted his life story according to the American dream. I used to think of life as an upward line from A to B, he says. My B was the house, a car, a good job, money for retirement. B is always better and more. But after the fire, I realized that B is not more money. B is Christ-likeness. It's holiness. The top of the ladder, he says, is not a house or money or job security, but God doing everything he can to make me more like Jesus. He cares more about my heart than he does my house. Proverbs 15:17 applies the same truth to relationships. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a fattened ox and hatred with it. We might paraphrase this: better a loving family that lives on rice and beans than a family consumed with strife, even if they're consuming the best steak. If you can't have a meal or get through a meal without harsh words and fighting, the steak will be sour in your stomach. But with love, every meal becomes a feast. Just as then the fear of the Lord is an aspect of righteousness that we can pursue, loving relationships is another aspect of righteousness and can become a practical priority for God's steward. It's no coincidence that these two things are what Jesus calls the greatest commandments. Love God, love others, the priority for the life of a disciple and a steward. So one of the hardest and most important moments in the Apollo program was the Apollo 1 fire, in which Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives. Until then, NASA had had a perfect safety record in space capsules, but the fire revealed that the program's preoccupation with achieving a moon mission at the earliest moment, with beating the Russians, keeping Kennedy's promise, this had taken a high toll in quality assurance, safe engineering, and even in management. After the fire, NASA had a new priority: doing everything right, what we might call righteousness. As Jim Donovan says in Shoot for the Moon, everyone in the organization and every contractor associated with the spacecraft was more committed than ever to that goal. The fire had made it personal. Tragic though it was, the fire clearly saved the program from losing lives in space. So the first practical application of stewardship is really a priority. As a steward, I'm more concerned about righteousness, the fear of the Lord, and loving relationships than about personal success and personal fulfillment. So how are you doing relative to that priority? Is there anything that needs to change in life to give that priority the place it deserves? Okay, moving on in Proverbs, we get even more practical. Diligence is the second thing here. It's not enough to have right priorities. You actually have to work on them to pursue a long obedience in the same direction. Proverbs famously illustrates this with ants. Proverbs 30:25, the ants are a people not strong, yet they provide their food in the summer. The author of Proverbs had clearly watched ants carrying huge burdens of food back to the ant mound and lauded this diligence. First time I went to Nepal, we went to a little park with Abby's family, and I got preoccupied with filming a diligent ant colony. Apparently they were making a move, and many of them were carrying some kind of burden from one place to another. Okay? So Proverbs 6:6 says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. Of course, in several places, Proverbs drops the image and just comes straight out in favor of diligence. Proverbs 10:4. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Again, it's a proverb, not a promise. Diligence does not inevitably make you rich. But I think in normal life, the correlation between diligence and prosperity would be stronger than the correlation prosperity preachers try to sell, that giving to their ministry will lead to prosperity. And certainly, as we look at the proverb, the flip side, the bad effects of laziness are often true in our lives. I actually preached a whole sermon on this last year called Hard Work Never Killed Anybody. One of the things I noted was the huge decrease in employment among men of typical working age, 25 to 54. One study tried to find out what these men were doing. These non-workforce men, it says, gained an additional 2,150 hours of free time each year. What is striking, however, is how little of this enormous dividend of extra free time is devoted to activities that would be of help to others in the family or the community. These men spend no more time on household duties or child care than employed men. They spend less time in religious and volunteer activities than any of the three other groups. They spend more time on personal care and on socializing, relaxing, and leisure. In fact, these things are akin to a full-time job for the unworking American male. They commit more time to attending gambling establishments, to tobacco and drug use than either working men, working women, or unemployed men. And their media consumption alone more than fills up the extra hours each day freed by their lack of employment. To a distressing degree, the report concludes, these men appear to have relinquished what we ordinarily think of as adult responsibilities, not only as breadwinners, but as parents, family members, community members, and citizens. Having freed themselves of such obligations, they fill their days instead with the full-bore pursuit of more immediate sources of gratification. That sounds remarkably like Proverbs 24. Starting at verse 30, I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. And the second practical principle of stewardship, of life management, is work hard. Be diligent. How are you doing? Are you someone who might be characterized by a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, when you could, in fact, be pursuing God's mission for your life? Are you one who lives your days in full-bore pursuit of gratification? We need to examine ourselves out of these things. The Apollo program, of course, is a huge example of diligence. 400,000 people all working on one mission that was larger than any of them. The astronauts were not the only component of that, of course, but their training is representative of the diligence Apollo required. As Jim Donathan says in Shoot for the Moon, the three crewmen of Apollo 11 trained 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and often 7, and spent much of any time they had left reading reports, procedures, and mission rules, and the mission rules alone made a thick book. It was characterized by diligence. Next, the practical life management of a steward has to include planning. Don't give me that face. Most of us hate planning. But the book of Proverbs makes it clear that things like plans and budgets make a difference in life. If we are to be stewards, especially in the area of our finances, but also time and energy, we need to make plans and be able to put them into effect. We need life plans that give us the freedom to give out of those things. So a few quick verses and recommendations. Proverbs 21:5, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. People who plan the spending of their money generally do better than those who wing it. Impulse buying, bad habit buying, no research buying will get you into trouble. It was Amazon Prime Day last week. How many people in America made an impulse purchase that they couldn't afford? Actually, I made an impulse purchase, but it was okay. If you shop every day for a $5 cup of coffee rather than brew it at home for 50 cents, if you immediately replace everything in your world that gets a glitch, from cars to air conditioners to iPhones, then those I would call bad buying habits. And finally, if you buy things with no research and end up with buyer's remorse to the tune of thousands of dollars a year, you need to consider planning your purchases, researching your purchases, and sticking to a budget. Ugh! But Proverbs 27:23 says, know well the condition of your flocks, and give attention to your herds, for riches do not last forever, and a crown does not endure to all generations. I mean, even Jesus says this, Luke 14:28. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Jesus is talking specifically there about the cost of the discipleship, the cost of 24/7, 365 stewardship, but he uses common financial wisdom to illustrate that. If you're going to build something, you make a budget. You count the cost so that you're not embarrassed later by failing to have enough to complete the project. Life as God's steward is a project, and we do better at it when we count the costs in time, energy, and money to do the things we want to commit to doing. One of the ways I say this in premarital counseling is, know how much money you have and where it is. This sounds trivial, but it makes for great peace of mind, especially when money is tight. A budget is helpful for this, but simple record keeping also goes a long way. Life goes better when you keep track of money, of time, of energy. This may sound a little boring and routine. Get over it, friend. God never promised that being a wise and faithful steward would always be exciting. A couple of other financial and life management principles. Proverbs 16:3. Commit your work to the Lord and your plans will be established. Planning is good, but as believers, we get to make our plans in light of God's desires and priorities for our lives. For example, without pointing the finger at anyone here, if you have a child who's gifted in some sport and you plan to help them see how far they can go in that sport, good. But if that sport has commitments every Sunday morning, maybe those plans are not what God has in mind for you and your child with your stated priorities. Proverbs also recommends getting counsel on these decisions over and over. Proverbs 15:22. Without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. As stewards who are not striving for expressive individualism, not always trying to do it my way, we can humble ourselves. We can take advice and counsel in many areas. God has surrounded us with wise, experienced people, and it just makes sense to take their counsel seriously. One of my favorite Apollo stories is about Bill Tyndall. the man who saved Apollo, he's sometimes called. He went up to MIT, where they were way behind on the guidance computer that we've talked about, and he said, you have got to double your staff now, or this is never going to happen. They said, we don't have time to train new staff. He said, you've got to. And he was right. And they did, and it happened. Another financial principle Proverbs commends is don't do debt. How many in our shopping for happiness culture have gotten into crippling credit card debt? Proverbs 22:7 says, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. There's freedom in living debt-free, and borrowing on top of that is a temptation to sin. Psalm 37:21, the wicked borrows, but does not pay back. But the righteous is generous and gives. If you want freedom to give generously, cheerfully, as we'll talk about next week, debt is your worst enemy. So all this planning, of course, was a hallmark of the Apollo program. Many have said that the management of these 400,000 people, these 20,000 companies, this $25 billion project, in dollars at those times, that was the greatest achievement of all, greater even than the actual moon landing. But the illustration of Apollo planning I want to use is back to this whole idea of guidance and navigation. You've probably heard the word rendezvous. Virtually every space mission after Mercury had the need for 2 or more spacecraft to meet up in space in the same place in the same orbit. Without rendezvous and docking, Apollo could never have worked. But it turns out that the key to rendezvous is planning. As Charles Fishman says in his great Apollo book, One Giant Leap, he says, in fact, rendezvous in space is a kind of a puzzle where you have to start at the ending and work backward. Rendezvous requires a lot of math. It requires thinking ahead. You can't simply launch spaceships into orbit and get them to rendezvous. You have to plan in advance, and the plan involves where you are launching from, where you're going to, what orbit the spaceship you're chasing is in, what time of day it is, how fast everything is going. You have to work out the plan in advance. Then you have to follow it, or you stand no chance of connecting with that spaceship. Stewardship of God's resources requires planning. So we've gotten increasingly practical. Since our very lives and all we have belong to God and are a gift from Him, we manage what He has given us by pursuing righteous goals, practicing diligence, and embracing planning. And fourth, we prefer dependence. Dependence on God is the great secret and the great reward of stewardship. Trying to be a steward while depending on yourself is frustrating. It's fearful, but depending on God actually turns out to be fun. Jesus teaches this in a parable, Luke 12:15-21, and He said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And He told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your life is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Life does not consist of the abundance of your possessions, no matter how much our culture may say the opposite. It doesn't consist of how much riches you've stored up. Only God gives true meaning to life. Stewardship is a way of depending on God and being rich toward Him. Paul agrees with this, 1 Timothy 6:6-10. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, and into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin or destruction. Almost sounds like Proverbs. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. The pursuit of worldly riches, worldly gain, leads to ruin, destruction, and evil. But stewardship, here called godliness with contentment, that's great gain. We brought nothing into the world. We take nothing out. We can only depend on God. 1 Timothy 6:17 through 19. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Our hopes are not set on what this world can provide, but we depend on God, who richly provides everything we have, everything we need, everything we enjoy. In that dependence, we can live as stewards, rich in good works, generous, ready to share. Finally, simply, Hebrews 13:5 reminds us, keep your life free from love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. We're content with what we have. We do not pursue happiness through shopping or self-fulfillment through expressive individualism, because we already have the greatest gain, the greatest gift of all, dependence on a God who has, from eternity past, been working out this big idea promise, I will never leave you or forsake you. What else could we want in life? Now, dependence on God may not sound practical, but it is, in fact, the final and maybe the most important practical key to life management. I mean, the truth is you can't manage your life in your own strength. And in your own strength, you can't even manage your life on his behalf. But as you depend on him, then you can become his good and faithful steward.